Last week, we learned about how the great Ralph Waldo Emerson was actually, surprisingly enough, the least promising among his four other siblings, except for one of his brothers, Bulkley, who was cognitively impaired from birth. The least promising. We learned of Emerson's intense feelings of inferiority and of the fact that he graduated in the bottom half of his class at Harvard. We learned about how Emerson's truly brilliant brother, Edward, suffered a complete mental breakdown while studying law under the great Daniel Webster. And about how Edward and his younger brother Charles both died while quite young of exhaustion and tuberculosis, as their father had done at the age of 42. We learned that Emerson's first wife, Ellen Tucker, also died, and also of tuberculosis, tragically after only a year and a half of marriage, thus widowing Waldo Emerson at the tender age of 28. We learned, too, that Emerson was a ninth-generation clergy person who, for years, agonized over his vocational identity as a Unitarian minister before finally resigning from Second Church in Boston in 1832 and taking in time to the lecture platform instead. Thus, we learned that many of Emerson's most famous exhortations to trust thyself, to be yourself, to never imitate, to go it alone and be self-reliant and so forth. We learned that many of these famous exhortations actually arose to a significant degree from his own personal inner struggles in his search at last to find the courage to overcome his family's expectations in order to do what he wanted to do and could do, and not just what his family and others expected him to do. Well, today, I'd like to continue this story by looking more closely, first, at Emerson's inner struggle concerning the ministry, and secondly, by looking at his radical critique of the church as expressed in his famous Harvard Divinity School address. Again, I want to take you behind the scenes. In particular, I want to look at how that celebrated and electrifying Divinity School address was deeply influenced both by Emerson's own vocational struggles as a newly minted Unitarian minister and by his profoundly unsatisfactory experience with his own minister, the Reverend Barzillai Frost. First, then, a little necessary background. American Unitarianism in the 1830s, while certainly a contested and controversial sect among the Orthodox, was nevertheless, on the whole, a highly respectable religion. While Unitarianism was only officially organized in this country in 1825, it was increasingly the progressive religion of the affluent middle and upper classes, successful, well-educated people of common sense, money, and good taste. While Unitarianism was once, and not long before, a religion of revolt, By the 1830s, it quickly had begun to settle into its own progressive brand of conformity and liberal orthodoxy. By today's standards, Unitarianism at that time was a thoughtful but fairly conservative, biblically based Christian church. In the 1830s, Unitarianism's basic tenets were that Christianity, first of all, was a divinely inspired religion. Secondly, it was attested to by the miracles of Jesus Christ. And thirdly, the Unitarian view of Christianity was that it was confirmed by a proper exercise of reason. The Bible, they believed, and this is very important, the Bible was the only source of Christian truth. Although, as they saw it, biblical truth had been at points perversely corrupted for centuries with poor translations and unwarranted speculations. And thus, the Unitarian ministers of the day, including Emerson, were extensively trained at places like Harvard Divinity School, which was then dominated by the Unitarians. They were trained in the latest methods of biblical criticism and interpretation. So the result of all of this was a highly rational, non-emotional religion, with ancient miracles, to be sure, but little mystery, with vigorous discussion and disputation, for sure, but little inspiration. To Emerson, Unitarianism appeared to be to him a sturdy structure, and it was, but one he increasingly came to see as resting on a crumbling foundation. The late Lewis Leary, the contemporary Emersonian scholar, puts it this way. He says, and I quote, "The progressive new religion of New England, Unitarianism, had become the servant of people more at ease in the counting house or at the champagne and oyster suppers than at the table of the Lord." Unitarianism, Leary continues, became factual, unimaginative, pallid, and unexciting. End quote. In short, for Emerson and a few others, as we shall see, for Emerson, Unitarianism had in effect lost its soul. It had lost its spiritual bearings and its spiritual foundation. So it was against this background, after years of sorting through his own deeply mixed feelings about the Unitarian ministry, and finally deciding to give it all up, that Emerson in 1838 delivered his blast, not only to American religion in general, but to American Unitarianism in particular. The occasion, again, was the Harvard Divinity School commencement address, one of the most important of Emerson's many addresses. The soul is not preached, Emerson shockingly declared to a room full of divinity school graduates, professors, students, and ministers. The soul is not preached. The church seems to totter to its fall, almost all life extinct. It is time that this ill-suppressed murmur of thoughtful men against the famine of the churches should be heard through the sleep of indolence and over the din of routine. This great and perpetual office of the preacher is not being discharged. In how many churches, by how many prophets, tell me, is man made sensible that he is an infinite soul? The assumption that the age of inspiration is past, that the Bible is closed, the fear of degrading the character of Jesus by representing him as a man, indicate with sufficient clearness the falsehood of our theology. It is the office of the true teacher to show us that God is, not was, that he speaketh, not spake. With inflamed words like these, which you can imagine shocked and outraged many in his audience, Emerson sought to address what he considered to be the crumbling foundation beneath the sturdy academic structure, and thus to point the way to a revitalization, to a re-spiritualization of American Unitarianism. Rather than looking for the well springs of divinity exclusively within the Bible and in the distant events of Jesus' life 2,000 years ago, however providential that might have been, Emerson urged instead consideration of seeking the divine in nature and within, the latter of which he called the oracle within, or the soul. And it was this soulfulness which he found so lacking in the wooden preaching all about him, which is where Emerson's minister, the Reverend Barzillai Frost, comes in. After Emerson resigned his full-time pulpit at Second Church in Boston in 1832, after about 3 years of ministry, he secured a job as what was then called stated supply preacher for the East Lexington, Massachusetts Unitarian Church, a then newly formed congregation. As stated supply preacher, the arrangement was such that Emerson would preach most Sundays, which he valued, but without having to be involved in all of the administrative and pastoral duties throughout the week, which he clearly disliked and at which he was not particularly adept. This stated supply arrangement suited Emerson well, being made possible in part, I might add, by a small inheritance from his recently deceased wife, Ellen Tucker. Indeed, Emerson continued as stated supply preacher at East Lexington and elsewhere for about 5 years, with breaks for a month or two, and now and then for illness, vacation, or special study periods. Meanwhile, during this period of 5 years as stated supply preacher, he was starting to begin to prepare lectures for his newly evolving career on the lecture circuit. And indeed, by the way, he came to Milwaukee at least twice that I've been able to tell. It was during this period in his evolving career, and because of these circumstances, that Emerson was able to attend Sunday services occasionally in his hometown Unitarian Church in Concord. It was here that the Reverend Barzillai Frost, the church's minister, made a profound impression on Emerson. Unfortunately, it was a profoundly negative impression. And so it was. In his journal, Emerson frequently comments on Barzillai Frost's loud and hollow, ragged and half-screaming preaching. The worst part of it, about it, however, was how uninspiringly academic and unreal it was. Here is a young man, Emerson writes privately in his journal, who has not yet learned the capital secret of his profession, namely to convert life into truth. Not one single fact in all of his personal experience has yet been imported into his doctrine, and there he stands, pitiable and magisterial, and without nausea reads page after page of mouth-filling words, and seems to himself to be doing a deed. This man has plowed and rowed and talked and bought and sold. He has read books and eaten and drunk. His cow calves, his bull genders. He smiles and suffers and loves, and yet all of this experience is still aloof from his intellect. He has not converted one jot of it into wisdom. Another entry in Emerson's journal, after listening to the uninspired preaching of Barzillai Frost, is this one. At church all day, but almost tempted to say, I would go no more. The snowstorm was real, the preacher merely spectral. Vast contrast to look at him and then out the window. While outwardly Emerson had no reason to be anything but perfectly cordial with Frost, inwardly Emerson's journals clearly show that he was struggling with Frost like the story of Jacob struggling with the devil till dawn. It was, in other words, an epic struggle for Emerson, but not just with Frost. Indeed, Emerson's struggle was taking place on at least two different levels. First, Emerson was struggling with the state of the churches of the day, especially the Unitarian churches. And at this level, Barzillai Frost was a symbol for Emerson for all that was wrong with the churches and with the fallen state of preaching. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Emerson was struggling with his own failure in the ministry and his impending decision whether or not to leave the ministry altogether, including his stated supply arrangement in East Lexington. As Emersonian scholar Conrad Wright puts it, in criticizing Frost in his journal, Emerson was, and I quote, arguing with himself, trying to be reassured that the blame for his leaving the ministry lay not with him, but with society, end quote. Well, coincidentally, it was only a matter of a couple of days between the time that Emerson finally decided to give up his last formal tie to the Unitarian ministry by giving up his post as stated supply at East Lexington. It was only a couple of days between that decision and the time that he received the invitation to deliver the commencement address at Harvard Divinity School. Imagine that. Here's a guy who just quit the ministry. just a couple of days ago, and now he's got an invitation to speak at this prestigious divinity school that is graduating Unitarian ministers. Wow, what a juxtaposition. Well, hopefully at this point, it begins to be much easier to see now how Emerson's celebrated but shocking divinity school address can be heard on multiple levels. Remember Emerson's journal entries about the Reverend Barzillai Frost's loud and hollow preaching? Well, hear it again, although without mentioning Frost's name this time and with some other changes, but this time we hear it not from Emerson's private journal, but we hear it in Emerson's celebrated divinity school address. I once heard a preacher, Emerson said in the divinity school address, I once heard a preacher who sorely tempted me to say I would go to church no more. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real, the preacher merely spectral. And the eye felt the sad contrast in looking at him and then out the window behind him into the beautiful meteor of snow. He had lived in vain. He had no one word intimating that he laughed or wept, was married or in love, had been commended or cheated or chagrined. If he had ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it. The capital secret of his profession, namely to convert life into truth, he had not learned. Not one fact in all of his experience had he yet imported into his doctrine. This man had plowed and planted and talked and bought and sold. He had read books. He had eaten and drunken. His head aches. His heart throbs. He smiles and suffers. Yet there was not a surmise, not a hint in all the discourse that he had ever lived at all. No matter how mixed Emerson's motivations may have been in writing his divinity school address and delivering it on that warm summer evening on July 15, 1838, no matter what the motivations, the impact of what he said was tremendous. I dare say that it is still working upon us even today. Indeed, think about it. If Emerson had not left the church, had not resigned, arguably he might not have been quite so bold in his pronouncements as he was. In any case, to this day, we are deeply indebted to Ralph Waldo Emerson, for his was a clarion call to lay a new foundation for Unitarianism. And we did. Beginning with that critically important address at Harvard Divinity School, Emerson began to move us as Unitarians inexorably from a fairly conservative, biblically based, exclusively Christian faith to a much more liberal, open, and inclusive faith grounded in the authority of what Emerson used to call the oracle within. Indeed, that was the beginning of an absolutely key, of an absolutely foundational shift within Unitarianism. Because we have forever thereafter, since Emerson, been declaring that for us at least, not for others maybe, but for us as Unitarian Universalists, spiritual authority comes not from the church. Spiritual authority comes not from the Bible. Spiritual authority does not come from the moral authority of Jesus. Nor, for that matter, does spiritual authority come from any other holy book or spiritual leader. Not from the Quran or Muhammad, not from the Dhammapada or Buddha, not from the Tao Te Ching or Lao Tzu, not from the Upanishads or Krishna. Rather, for us, beginning with Ralph Waldo Emerson, spiritual authority, it was decided, ultimately comes from within. It ultimately comes from what Emerson used to call the oracle within, the conscience or the soul. Thus, Emerson, out of his own vocational struggles and his own original insight, almost single-handedly in time transformed the American religious landscape in general and transformed the American Unitarianism in particular. Emerson said it 183 years ago. And I would echo his call just as fervently today. We keep forgetting this. For our spiritual sustenance, we need to go deep within, Emerson insisted. Neither the tropes of Jesus or the Bible in Emerson's day, nor the pressing social justice causes of our day will save us. Friends, we cannot live, as Emerson knew well, on prophecy or on good works or on bread alone. We need to tend deeply, ultimately, to our souls, to the dimension of depth within us and out of which we live our lives. We need to go, we need to be in touch within. Indeed, within us, as Emerson once expressed it, is the soul of the whole. The wise silence, the universal beauty. When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it is love. Such is at least a glimpse of the Emersonian vision, a vision which comes out of his own personal and vocational struggles, and a vision which is still working upon us even today.